Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Royal Society of Canada Governor-General Lecture Series. I'm Steve Pascolato with CBC Television here in Saskatoon. Great to see everybody here today. CBC is very pleased to partner on this lecture with the U of S Research Communications and the Royal Society. Last fall, the University of Saskatchewan was presented with the tremendous opportunity to host our guest, Dr. Clyde Hertzman, as part of the Royal Society of Canada's prestigious Governor-General Lecture Series. The Royal Society of Canada is the senior national body of distinguished Canadian scholars, artists, and scientists that advises governments and organizations and promotes Canadian culture. This series, which involves lectures across Canada by distinguished researchers and scholars, is meant to highlight an outstanding fellow of the Society whose research and scholarship is of timely interest to Canadians. The title of this lecture series reflects the fact that the Governor-General has input into the speaker selection process. Since 1918, 66 faculty members from the University of Saskatchewan have been elected to the Royal Society of Canada. I'd now like to introduce Brett Fairburn, Provost and Vice President Academic at the University of Saskatchewan, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Steve. Children symbolize a society's future and represent a powerful and emotive bond between today and tomorrow. Children also illustrate our interdependency as human beings. Every generation looks to them with a mixture of hope and desire to help. Good afternoon and welcome to this special lecture on a topic that is of great importance to Canadians, the challenges we face as a society when children's development in their early years is neglected or poorly supported, and what we can do cooperatively as parents, educators, and community stakeholders to overcome those challenges. That issue, the societal challenges resulting from childhood development, is of primary concern to researchers in our Department of Community Health and Epidemiology, who are among the leaders in Canada in understanding the individual and collective factors that determine health. This team of researchers coordinates a provincial network of about 500 individuals called the Saskatchewan Knowledge to Action Network for Early Childhood Development, or KidSCAN for short. I understand that many members of KidSCAN are attending today's lecture or are listening to it in various parts of Saskatchewan through the internet, as this talk is being streamed live on the University of Saskatchewan website. That's a wonderful example of the outreach and engagement with community that is so fundamental to our university's research efforts. The University of Saskatchewan is very proud to have been selected by the Royal Society of Canada to host this lecture, which we are told is the first national research lectures series in Canada. It provides a national platform on which to showcase the finding of leading researchers such as our speaker today. We're honored to welcome Dr. Hertzman to our campus. As Steve mentioned, Dr. Hertzman is Canada Research Chair in Population Health and Human Development at the University of British Columbia. His research on the effects of the environment on the development of young children has been extremely influential, not only within the research community, but at a policy level, both nationally and internationally. He was recently awarded the 2010 Michael Smith Prize by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the top national award for health researchers in Canada, an outstanding recognition of his work. Dr. Hertzman is an expert in social and biological factors that play a critical role in early childhood. He's director of the Human Early Learning Partnership, also known as HELP, which is an internationally recognized and unique Canadian research network that integrates the behavioral and social sciences with biomedical sciences and focuses on early human development. Through this partnership, Dr. Hertzman and his team work closely with government and with communities to understand how different environments contribute to different developmental outcomes for children around the world. Nationally, he was appointed president of the Council on Early Childhood Development, which is a national nonprofit organization. Internationally, in 2005, he was appointed team leader of the World Health Organization's Early Child Development Global Knowledge Hub based at HELP. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Dr. Clyde Hertzman.
Well, good morning. Oh no, it's afternoon. Standard time, it's afternoon, and it's wonderful to be here. For those of you who have heard me present before or seen me present before, what you'll be used to is me coming with a big, thick deck of PowerPoint slides and being very, very technocratic. However, the Governor General's lecture provides an opportunity to take a step back a little bit and to reflect on things. And so as somebody who has been working in recent years on the issues of early development, as we say, from cell to society, literally from the point of understanding the biological right through to understanding the global. This is a chance for me to step back and reflect on where we've got up to in Canadian society in this area. And that's what this talk is going to be about today. And it's going to be without PowerPoints, basically. I'm just going to talk. To start off with, we may want to reflect on what we would want for our children. After all, many of us have children in our society, and we need them. They are our future. And I personally am a grandfather at this point. I think we want them healthy. I think we want them happy. I think we want them fulfilled. And I think we want them having the skills they need to cope in the modern world. And if that's true, we have a problem. Because getting those things for our children really does mean supporting them and their families in the early stages of their development. And my thesis that I want to give to you today is that in order to do that effectively, societies like Canada have to generate something that a political scientist who I work with, Peter Hall, has called collective implementation goods. That's a bit of a pointy-headed term. And I will come back to it later on and define it. But what I want to say to us is that our society has trouble both recognizing and generating what I'm going to call collective implementation goods. So first off, why do I think we should shine a light on the early years? And it comes down to two things. It comes down to the state of early development in Canada and the reasons why it's important. So in terms of the state of early child development in Canada, you should all know that as a result of a wonderful Canadian invention called the Early Development Instrument, we actually have information on the state of children's development in transition from preschool to school that we collect across all children in their senior kindergarten year. The tool was developed originally at McMaster University as part of a national collaboration, and it now covers approximately 80% of the population of Canadian children on a periodic basis. And Saskatchewan, like the province of British Columbia, where I work, has got population-based data then on the state of children's development at the time that they are in their kindergarten year, which is the transition from the early years, if you'd like, into the school years. I'm not going to spend a lot of time describing how this tool works, but one thing you should understand is it allows us to estimate the fraction of children who are behind where we'd like them to be in their development, in the key domains of development that matter. In other words, in their physical development, in their social and emotional development, in their language and cognitive development, and in the effectiveness of their communication skills. And it allows us then to estimate the fraction of children who are vulnerable or behind where we'd like them to be in one or more of those domains of development. And so we have data in this country that allows us to say what the state of development of children is in their transition to school, so that the proportion of children who are vulnerable in one or more scales of their development on this EDI, this early development instrument, is to child development what the infant mortality rate is to child survival. And as a result of that, then when we can report out on it, and its variations, and its avoidability, and the statistics for Canada are not wonderful. Basically, across the country, depending on what province you're in, between 25 and 30% of the children are vulnerable on one or more domains of development when they reach school age. Here in Saskatchewan, it's standing at about 27%, so Saskatchewan's pretty much dead in the middle of the country. The other thing that we've done, though, is we've broken the country down into over 2,000 neighborhoods and put the children into the neighborhoods where they are growing up, based on their 6-digit postal codes. And when you look at the fraction of children who are vulnerable by neighborhood across the country, what you see is absolutely astonishing levels of variation. So in the lowest vulnerability neighborhoods in Canada, approximately 4% of the children are vulnerable on one or more scales of the development. In the highest vulnerability neighborhoods, it's standing at about 68%. So there is, in fact, a 17-fold variation in the fraction of vulnerable kids from the least to the most vulnerable neighborhoods in this country. Moreover, we know from the work that we've done now across the country, looking at thousands of neighborhoods, some of them 2, 3, and 4 times, that it is both possible and feasible to bring vulnerability down below 10% and keep it below 10%. Accordingly, then, across the country, on average, 60 to 70% of the vulnerability we are seeing is avoidable if children had had a better start in life. So think about it. At the time of birth, only about 3 or 4% of children have something, such as profound prematurity or a diagnosable condition or a condition that will emerge soon afterwards, which ought to make them vulnerable in their development. And yet what we're seeing in this country is something whereby from the time of birth basically through to school age, the fraction of children who emerge as vulnerable in their development goes up approximately 7-fold on average. And we see excess vulnerability in more than 90% of the neighborhoods in the province, neighborhoods across the country. Finally, because the EDI tool has been around for over 10 years now, we've been able to track changes over time in different parts of the country. In an era when there's a lot of rhetoric about the early years, there's a lot of politicians who claim that they are committed to families with children, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found, sadly, is very little evidence of net progress. And in fact, in some jurisdictions, the neighborhoods where vulnerability is going up is exceeding the number of neighborhoods where vulnerability is going down as much as 3 and 4 to 1. So the state of early child development in Canada right now is one where there's a very, very large burden of excess vulnerability. There is a huge level of unjustifiable variation from neighborhood to neighborhood across the country that cannot be assigned to genetic causes or things like that. And there's very little progress in the country so far. So if that's the state of early child development, why should it be a significant concern? And there are a number of reasons for that. The first is that early experience becomes actually embedded in human biology, so that early attachment embeds itself in the way that the systems that connect the vision to deep structures in our midbrain, like the amygdala and the locus coeruleus, function. And those things go on then to drive the way that our executive functions work and how we make decisions. Language development early on in life goes up as a straight dose response with the quality of language that kids hear early on in life. The number of words they hear spoken directly to them, not off the television, directly to them, whether or not they're asked questions or not, whether or not people get down at eye level with them so that the children experience the social and emotional information bound up in the human face that goes along with the interchanges, whether or not children are read bedtime stories and so forth. And what we see is that kids' capacity to understand language and their capacity to express it goes up pretty much as a straight dose response with the number of words that are spoken to them per unit time and the ways in which they are spoken to them. So it turns out then that these things embed themselves in brain cell synapses, right, and embed themselves in capabilities. So that by the time kids reach school age, you know, if a child has only ever had 1 or 2 or 3 word interrogatives shouted at them, like, get away from that, and that's all they've ever heard, are suddenly expected to be able to parse a 15-word sentence spoken in a normal tone of voice, or to understand how to model expertise through answering a question. And you understand, answering a question is a complex social act that requires circuits to fire. Asking a child who's never had that experience to suddenly do it when they reach school age is like asking a kid who's been tied into their crib for 5 years to get up and run 100 meters. There's physical reasons that it can't happen. So that is one of the reasons that the early years matter a great deal. We also know that these early experiences and the state of development that they create go on to influence health, well-being, learning, and behavior across the balance of the life course. So what I'm saying by that is that we now, across the Western world and in some developing countries, have got studies that started at the time of birth, or even before in some cases, and have followed groups of children 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 decades into life. So it is possible to empirically demonstrate the way in which things that have occurred early and the state of children's development by the time they reach school age is independently influencing grade failure, early criminality, unwanted pregnancy in the second decade of life, mental health problems and obesity and early increases in blood pressure in the third and fourth decades of life, the immersion of chronic diseases by the fifth and sixth decades of life, and premature aging and memory loss later on. So we're talking about direct empirical observations that way. Third, we now understand, because of the revolution in epigenesis, that in fact what is going on is not just that experience is getting under the skin in some metaphoric way to change the way things work, but it's actually getting right down into our DNA and influencing how different genes express themselves, or whether different genes express themselves. We have long known that there had to be mechanisms that allowed different stretches of the DNA to be turned on and turned off by factors outside of the DNA. After all, as the fetus is developing, something has to turn a brain cell into a brain cell and a blood cell into a blood cell and a skin cell into a skin cell, because they all have exactly the same DNA in it. So everybody always understood that there were principles that turned those things on and off so that different parts of the DNA would be expressed. But over the last 10 or 15 years, since the full human genome has been read and these new techniques have come along, we have come to understand that the process of turning on and off different genes in a long-term way is not confined just to when organs are differentiating, that it continues throughout pregnancy and well into early life. So we now have evidence that social circumstances, that mother's stress, that the early nutritional environment, that smoking during pregnancy, that abuse and neglect, that a whole range of things can affect the expression of different genes in different organ systems of the body, and therefore drive our life chances in that kind of way. And then finally, when you put all this together, it's not hard to see the way in which ignoring the early years then becomes potentially a long-term drain on societal capacities, that in fact we need the development of certain cognitive, social, emotional skills and the removal of physical limitations as best we can to be able to cope in the modern world. So the state of children's development, the fact that 60 or 70% of the vulnerabilities that children are bringing to school age are avoidable, matters because the state of early development matters in these kind of ways. So having said all of this, I want to come back to this pointy-headed term of collective implementation goods. So what am I talking about? Well, first, what they are not. One kind of goods that political scientists talk about are public goods. So public goods would be things like the Canada Pension Plan. In other words, governments collect up the tax money and can redistribute it. And once you get your check in the mail, the good has been delivered, right? So it is something that can be done exclusively in the public sphere. On the other side, you have private goods, like the cars that many of you came in here today, which we take our money and we purchase on the market, right? So those are private goods. What collective implementation goods are is something more like public goods, but not quite the same. They are outcomes for society that depend on the legitimacy, the interaction qualities, and the coordination capacities of a diffuse range of strategic leaders and actors in our society who work together to produce long-term successes. So in this case, we're talking about helping children thrive in their earliest years until, they go on the transition, right? So as you can see, public provision is a cornerstone of that. But public provision in and of itself is not enough. And I must say, and this morning on the radio and many times I'm always asked, well, what is the one thing that should be being done, right? And the question really bothers me because as we're going to talk about here, if we want to make a difference for our children, it's not about the one thing that can be done. It's about the many things that need to be done in concert with one another. And that's where the notion of collective implementation goods come in. So the point is, upon reflection, that we rarely recognize collective implementation goods in our society, even when we have them. And I'm going to come back to examples where we do have them. And nor do we recognize well enough, in fact, we tend to ignore or undermine the monitoring systems that we need to support them. So I want to talk a bit about this idea that collective implementation goods of the sort that we need in this area are indivisible in a certain way from monitoring systems. Because we're dealing here with things that are slow-moving and diffuse. You in the audience and I cannot tell by going outside and looking around whether or not there are 60% of the young children in this area are vulnerable in their development or 12%. It's not just out there. It's something that has to be measured. And so a good example of this is the example of the boiling frog. Many of us have heard this story about how if you put a frog in water at its normal temperature and you gradually increase the temperature of the water, the frog will boil to death without ever trying to get out of the water. Because what it does is it just sort of adapts to it as time is going on, right? And so big, slow-moving processes in society have that quality, that things change gradually enough that we don't really notice what's going on in a positive or negative direction. But imagine that this frog was numerate, and imagine that there was a thermometer in the water. The frog could watch the temperature changes, and when it got to a certain point, the frog could say, "Holy cow," or "Holy lily pad," or whatever it is that frogs say, and could get out at that time, right? So you can see that the big, slow-moving process and the monitoring system that is sensitive to it and provides credible feedback that our societies understand are indivisible from one another, right? And so in this context, what I'm proposing to you is that tools like the Early Development Instrument are very, very important monitoring tools, and that we as a society need to be paying very, very close attention to them. So that's why the monitoring system is very important. Why do I say that collective implementation goods are so important for early stages of human development? I mean, isn't it simply an issue that we need to do more public spending? And the answer is yes. Actually, we do need to do more public spending. And in fact, Canada is the lowest investor in early childhood learning and care in the Western world. But there are a number of things that mean that the money itself is not enough to consider in the equation. So consider these 4 issues. Right? First, the issue of supporting all the domains of development. Right? So supporting early stages of human development means doing a range of things to support the key evolving capacities of children. Their physical, their social emotional, and their language and cognitive. And doing it in ways that make families more effective rather than supplanting them. So right off the bat, that is a complex and subtle task. Second, if we think about just broadly those 3 broad domains of development, physical, social, emotional, language, and cognitive, and we ask, what institutional responses do we have to them so far? We find an interesting problem of mismatch. So for language and cognitive development, we have school. But as we can see, when you look at the nature of early human development, school starts way too late. because many of the elements of literacy, numeracy, effective language and communication skills, the executive functions that allow you to engage in focused attention are developing earlier on. So school, good though Canadian schools might be, starts too late. What about social and emotional development? Well, for social and emotional development, in effect, what we've got is the child protection system. But it is there really for very blunt issues. It is there for out-and-out abuse and neglect. It is not there to deal with the challenges that face a child who is physically aggressive but is not in an environment that's encouraging them to be less physically aggressive, or to deal with the challenges of children who are not socializing to the human face, and so forth. So that the child protection system, whereas it is an institutional response, is a blunt one. And similarly, if you ask what's there for physical development, well, we have the healthcare system. But the healthcare system is primarily there for disease, for its prevention, for its control, for its treatment. It is not there necessarily to deal with the issue of the child who does not have the physical coordination to be able to hold a pencil or a crayon. It might be there to deal with gross problems of hearing loss and difficulties learning language that way, but it's not there to deal with the child who can't distinguish between the sound of sh and ch, for instance. So what we have then, when you think about these three broad domains of development and our institutional responses, is one institutional response that starts too late and two other institutional responses which are way too blunt. Right? So that part of the task then is transforming a series of institutions which are very deeply embedded in our society. The third complexity is that when we ask ourselves, where are these vulnerable children that I'm talking about? It is not simply a case that they are found in neat packages. It's not as though you can go to the inner city area of Saskatoon and find all the vulnerable children there. You might find a higher proportion of vulnerable children in the inner city than you will in the ritziest suburb. But the difference is going to be a matter of degree. It's not a threshold process. So what we see as we go across the neighborhoods in Canada, that socioeconomic factors can explain, in a statistical sense, about half of the variation in vulnerability. But there's plenty left over. And as I pointed out before, about 90% of the vulnerability in Canada, at least about 90% of neighborhoods in Canada have excess vulnerability. So it turns out that if you try to target by socioeconomic factors, by geographic factors, by ethnic factors, by social risk factors, by biological risk factors, you never pick up the majority of the vulnerable kids. In fact, in BC, where we've played this exercise empirically, we can never pick up, using targeted methods, more than about 20% of the vulnerable children. So the fact is that this thing about vulnerability being spread broadly across middle-class communities as well as underprivileged communities, etc., means that we have to be aiming to create universal access, if you'd like, to the conditions that will support child development. So once again, that is not a simple thing to do from the standpoint of top-down public provision. And then finally, there is the complexity of where the determinants are found for early development. Everybody understands that the most important thing is the intimate interactions that the child has, which are primarily in the family and then in care centers of one sort or another. But the fact is that by early on in life, neighborhood factors are influencing children's development. And policy factors are influencing children's development by the way in which they influence work-life, home-life conflicts for the parents, and whether or not they have availability of leave programs, and whether or not they have adequate income to meet basic housing needs and things like that. And so forth up the line. The built environment comes in. The transportation system comes in, et cetera, et cetera. So what we end up with is a whole series of things from the most intimate to the most global in our society that are determinants of children's development. And so we have to be able to operate at all of those different levels. And so if you go back to what I said about collective implementation goods there, you see we're talking about something that has to deal with a range of domains of development, that has to be a partnership between families, service providers, communities, and the state. that has to operate diffusely, not only in designated high-risk areas, but in moderate and moderately low-risk areas as well. And so the notion of collective implementation goods is the notion, in a sense, of diffuse common purposes across multiple levels of society and both, vertically, if you'd like, and horizontally. Now that sounds demoralizing when I put it that way. But the fact is that we can find portraits of places that are functioning reasonably well. And here I go back again to the issue of the early development indicator and what it has provided for us as a monitoring tool. So for instance, in my jurisdiction in British Columbia, where we've completed the EDI on all of the kindergarten children 4 times now in the last 10 years. We have these serial cross-sections of kindergarten children, so we can say what is the trend of development, what has happened in the early years in different communities. And we've identified a number of places that we call trend buckers. That is to say, despite the fact that overall vulnerability has been going up in British Columbia, in these places it has been going down in a sustained way. And so we have places where it's dropped from 50% down to 20%. We've got other places where it's dropped from 25% down to between 5 and 10% where we want it to go. And what we've been doing then is trying to understand what it is that is going on in those communities. And we have a number of insights. One thing that those communities seem to have is strong intersectoral leadership. And here I do want to take a moment to say that you guys do have a policy of creating intersectoral coalitions in Saskatchewan, and that's a very important thing. So strong local intersectoral leadership means senior leaders from both the traditional and the non-traditional agencies that ought to serve young children working together. So it means childcare people, anti-poverty people, school people, health people, community planners, the economic sector, the recreation people, all working together to support the early years, to define the ecosystem for the early years, to figure out what it is that families need. And it's important that senior leaders be part of this because it's the senior leaders that bring the resources to the table. And when the senior leaders work together over a period of months and years together, they can start to learn how to create, in a sense, a new way of managing things in the community that can be way, way more family friendly. That occurs partly to do with my second point, which is that in the communities where this has worked, the people who are the nominal leaders, let's say the school superintendent, are viewed as being legitimate by the community. In other words, the community says, yes, we recognize that you are leaders and we want you to take a lead and we will respond to the proposals that you make. Very important thing, the idea that the people who are in leading roles are actually seen as being legitimate, and this is part of this collective implementation goods formula. The third thing is that these groups have used the early development instrument information in a strategic way. In other words, rather than just getting together and talking about interagency politics, they look at neighborhood maps of physical development and social and emotional development and language and cognitive development and say, where are these differences coming from? What can we do for physical development? What can we do about social emotional development? What can we do for language and cognitive development? And so the people delivering the story hour at the library start to realize that in certain neighborhoods the kids are not coming to the story hour, so maybe they need to take the stories out. Or maybe they need to work with the local childcare centers to get them there. Or they discover that in some places transportation is a barrier and so forth. But they focus on the outcomes. And they focus on the outcomes, on this next point, understanding that what we are trying to achieve is a kind of a proportionate universality. In other words, we want to create the conditions where all children can thrive, but that might mean different strategies in different areas of town, or with different ethnic groups, or according to different barriers. And so they work with lists of barriers of access, and they try to knock those things down. And then finally, the places that have been most successful have had what I'm going to call vertical coordination. In other words, it isn't a question that the local intersectoral coalition says, we can never trust the senior players, we just have to go it alone. But what happens is that they get together, they work out plans and strategies over time, and then they appeal to the senior governments to get resources in. And what we've discovered is not that strong localism is the opposite of drawing in tax resources from the federal and provincial governments, that those things go in tandem. And for those of you who have made a study of social capital, and you go back to the work that Putnam did on Italy and why northern Italy functions so much better than southern Italy, it's exactly the same story there, that the stronger the horizontal networks locally, the stronger the vertical pull of resources from the senior governments. So what I've described then, basically, is a portrait of reasonably effective collective implementation goods in some places. And the glass is half empty approach to that would be, well, to say, yeah, there's always going to be a few places that are exemplary. But the glass that is half full part of this is really about the idea that this complex challenge that I'm talking about can, in fact, be contained. We can shine a light on the character of these collective implementation goods. And in fact, we can learn about them. So the way I want to approach it now is to step back from early child development and talk about an example of a big problem in Canadian society that was in fact solved, it would seem, through the mobilization of collective implementation goods. And that would be the case of the profound decline in adult cigarette smoking in the last 30 years or so. So this is one of the triumphs of Canadian society, and in fact, several other Western societies as well, where we used to have adult cigarette smoking rates running over 60%, and now in most places in Canada, they are down under 15%, and in La La Land, where I live, it's down under 10%, right? So it's an enormous social change that occurred in a positive way. And you can say to people, particularly people who study interventions, you can say, okay, well, tell me, what was the discrete intervention that made that happen? Was it that doctors started telling people to stop smoking? Was it that we jacked up the price of cigarettes through taxation? Was it that we banned smoking in public places? Was it that we redefined the image of the smoker from the Marlboro man to somebody who we didn't want to have standing within 20 feet of ourselves? Was it because of lawsuits? And the answer is, in fact, that it was all of those things. That, in fact, what happened was a causal understanding got into the minds of the Canadian public that then motivated a series of actions at different levels of society, from what you and I say to people when they light up in front of us, right through to the level of taxation and government-sponsored lawsuits, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a case where, in fact, collective implementation goods were mobilized and produced a positive result for Canadian society. And so what can we learn from that example? Well, one of the things that we can learn from that example is that collective implementation goods are bound up with a notion of evidence-based social change. And that's pretty clear, that it was the causal understandings and the quality of the evidence that got to the point where everybody sort of understood that the only people who claimed that cigarette smoking was not a problem, both in terms of first-hand and second-hand smoke, were either manufacturing the stuff, selling the stuff, or still smoking the stuff, right? But that the arguments beyond conflict of interest were solid, right, in that respect. And in fact, when coming to that, I come then to a political scientist by the name of Paul Sabatier, who has spent a lot of time studying the way in which scientific ideas do or do not find their way into public policy. And what Sabatier says is that each of us, and in particular, I'm thinking here about people who influence policy, but the rest of us too, basically operate on three levels when it comes to thinking about the world around us. There's a superficial level, a middle level, and a deep level. Right? The superficial level is what he calls our procedural beliefs. And so this is sort of ideas of, do we think things should be centralized or decentralized? Do we think there should be broad consultations, or do we think the smartest people should just go ahead and do something? It's that kind of thing. And they tend to be the sort of things which in society go back and forth as a pendulum. So, the endless reorganizations that many of us have to put up with are based on that procedural level. So that's at the top level, where you could say, from a Goldilocks standpoint, that the porridge is too cold. At the deep core level, we have whether or not we believe in God, whether or not we think life is a struggle between good and evil, whether we are fundamentally egalitarians or libertarians. And those kind of things tend to be very deep and are not that easy to get people to examine. And so the old idea about not discussing religion or politics at the dinner table has got to do with this thing of not going to people's deep cores, because when you go to their deep core, you get an emotional reaction rather than a thinking reaction, right? Sabatier's idea is, though, that in between that, we have what he would call our policy core beliefs. And so what these are is an implicit, quite often it's an implicit set of causal assumptions that we make that are the lens through which we judge our world from a day-to-day basis, right? And those things, though, people quite often are prepared to take out and examine if you give them the right kind of information, right? And so we are putting on the table here a causal claim. We are saying that what goes on in those early years of life really matters in a very fundamental way for the rest of life. So that if you want to understand why certain schools are struggling with kids, maybe it's not the school. Maybe it's the state of how the kids came into the school earlier on. If we want to take on a mental health strategy nationally as part of our healthy living strategy, maybe we need to go back to the early social and emotional developmental roots of later mental health problems, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So that's the notion of the policy core beliefs. And that is where we need to attack this thing. So I have a question for you at this point, right? That in order to construe early child development in this way, we have to have a belief somewhere along the line that it takes a village to raise a child. In other words, we can't just leave families on their own, that we have to do these things together as communities. But we're up against something, which is that in 1620, they passed the Elizabethan Poor Laws back in Old England, and those laws were the opposite of it takes a village to raise a child. They said very explicitly that if you have children, they are your responsibility as a family. And if you do not dispose of that responsibility appropriately, we will step in and we will punish you, and we will punish the children as well. That was the standard, right? And then the Mayflower sailed, and that idea came over to Canada and the US, and it came over to Australia and New Zealand. Fast forward 400 years, and when you look at the amount of public spending that goes into the early years among the wealthy countries, the 6 English-speaking wealthy countries, UK, Ireland, Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand, when these statistics first started getting produced, were the 6 lowest investors in the early years. In other words, it doesn't take a village to raise a child zeitgeist that goes back at least 400 years and was renewed in the Poor Laws in the early part of the 19th century that were a part of Canadian society at that point, then are underlying. And so the question here is the degree to which families have to do it on their own is a part of deep core beliefs in English-speaking societies rather than a part of the policy core. And that's something that I'm leaving for you to think about, because one of the strategies that's being adopted to make a difference in the early years is what we call framing strategies. If only we can communicate the ideas in ways that will make sense to people who are used to 30-second sound bites, we'll be able to up the ante on this. And I want you to think about whether or not you think that's true. Now, having said that then, there are some ideas from the cigarette smoking example that you can transfer over. But of course, there are things then that are difficulties with the cigarette smoking example. The model, for instance, of causation is a toxic substance model. And most of us accept a toxic substance model. In other words, you smoke and you are putting poisons into your body. And so people accept the idea that the long-term exposure to poisons, the exposure of fetus to poison, et cetera, might make a difference to your health. The question is, right here, we have now, based on our EDI data and our links to the EDI data to student-level data and student-level data to economic growth data, have demonstrated, as well as any economist can demonstrate, that for every 1% that we could reduce vulnerability on the EDI, the economy in Canada would grow 1% faster during the working lifetime of those kids, right? So in other words, if we could drop vulnerability from nearly 30% down to under 10%, it would generate 20% more economic growth in the Canadian economy over time. In the Saskatchewan context, if that were done here, that would mean having about $100 billion dropped into your bank account now with interest bearing at competitive market rates for the next 60 years, right? So we've produced a model that shows that sort of thing. In other words, for every $1 spent to reduce vulnerability, about $6 would return to the economy. And so what I want you to ask yourself is, given all the things that I've said about the importance of the early years, and I've now thrown this thing out to you, is whether or not, even though that sounds like an amazing thing, whether or not you're prepared to accept that at the same level of certainty that you are that cigarette smoking, say, causes lung cancer and is a crappy thing for a fetus to be exposed to. So that's something to ask yourself. The second point, though, is that the cigarette smoking thing involves changing a single kind of behavior, right? In other words, people to stop doing this, right? Whereas the kind of thing we're talking about requires so much more. It requires families functioning different, care providers functioning different, municipalities making decisions differently, senior governments putting new policy lenses on things. In particular, it requires the federal and provincial governments to commit to a modicum of financial support that is durable, that local actors can rely on and draw on over time, and to come up with a set of social policies that really do take the stresses and burdens off of families, which we can demonstrate over the last 15 years have been getting larger rather than smaller. And finally, the indicator in relation to smoking, the monitoring indicator, is a simple one. Cigarette smoking rates are easy to collect, and they're relatively non-controversial. But when you go out to monitor the early stages of human development, you have to invest a lot in it. You have to be constantly fighting indifference of one sort or another. And I know, Nazim, who's in the audience here today, has been working on the EDI the same way we have across the country and building the national platform so that we can make these comparisons. And the amount of effort that we have to put into to resist the idea that monitoring the early states of children's development, even at the population level, is somehow violating individual confidentiality, or despite all the evidence that we have that it's a valid marker, really shouldn't be taken too seriously. And despite all the efforts we make to link the data together with school data and health data and show the way the developmental trajectories work, that really, even though it's all being done in an anonymized way, really there's ethical violations there some way. And somehow or another, all of those things keep coming at us, so that it's very, very hard to get to the point where the feedback system is simply up and running and everybody can then get on and say, well, how come this community is doing so much better than that community, even though they're socioeconomically similar, right? Or why is that region doing better than this region? Or why did that place that started universal access to childcare 10 years ago, why do their outcomes look so different from this one over here, right? So we have that problem there. Now, having said all of that, though, the cigarette smoking example is not an isolated example of collective implementation goods in action. One of the other ones that's occurred, and I think this is a good one in terms of the recognition, has got to do with the hole in the ozone layer. How many remember when the hole in the ozone layer was the big problem, and that every year it was getting bigger, and it was as big as Antarctica, and it was continuing to get bigger? Well, 20 years ago or more, a protocol was signed in Montreal that was designed to actually start controlling chlorofluorocarbons around the world in order to shrink the hole in the ozone layer. And that required a diverse range of actors around the planet to do a diverse range of things. And guess what? The hole in the ozone layer is getting smaller. Not a lot of people seem to know that, but this is a case where the international community got together, made some decisions that require a wide range of actors to operate in concert, and it is working. That, in fact, the hole in the ozone layer is meant to be shut by about 2050, right? So when we think about the quotidian problems, the day-to-day problems of the early stages of human development, or the other big kahuna, which is shrinking our ecological footprint, which is a complex one as well, we do have precedents that we can mobilize collective implementation goods in ways that can solve the long-term challenges that our society faces. I do admit that collective implementation goods is a kind of a pointy-headed term, and my guess is that most of you are not going to sort of, have it with your breakfast cereal in the morning. But as an end user, as somebody who is working in this field, I think about this a lot because of the way in which we need to get so many things to be happening right in order to make progress. But I think that it has value from the standpoint of thinking about yourselves as citizens, because collective implementation goods require a bit of a redefinition of citizenship in 4 given respects. The first is that it requires the citizen to be numerate as well as literate. That is to say, I've talked about the monitoring systems, and the monitoring systems, reductionism and all, do come down to elements of numeracy. So it does mean that the citizen must be able to understand what a vulnerability rate would mean, and to understand the trends therein, right? Canada is not a very numerate society. And as a result of that, all sorts of manipulations go on. For instance, quite often what happens in our public discourse is that people spend a lot of time manipulating fear around quantitation, right? So somebody will say, the deficit that we have in this province is $5 billion. That's a lot of money. Well, actually, if you're numerate, whether $5 billion is a lot of money is a function of scale. If your economy is a $100 billion a year economy, $5 billion is not a lot of money. If your economy is $10 billion, then it is a lot of money, right? Most Canadians, at least electorally, don't seem to have the level of numeracy to be able to deal with that, or don't implement it when it counts, right? And so the issue of collective implementation goods in terms of citizenship, one thing it means is being a numerate society that can follow indicators that move slowly over time towards or away from common goals. The second is the notion of the citizen as a legitimizer. This is very, very important because we are in an era when a lot of glamour and stock, if you'd like, is placed around certain kinds of individual achievements. The hockey player who's paid millions, et cetera, et cetera. An awful lot less legitimizing goes toward the child care worker, the school superintendent who's prepared to open their school to bring in classes, to open it up for early childhood programs, the librarian who takes the stories to the community, the speech and language pathologist who takes the time to learn some of the languages of the new immigrant communities that have moved into the area, et cetera, et cetera. That is where we as citizens need to be doing our legitimizing, and we have to understand, our roles as legitimizers. The third thing is the long-term thinker. Many of us like to blame the politicians for short-term thinking. We say they only think from election to election. They won't think about cycles that are more than 3 or 4 years long. And that's true. But part of the reason that's true is that we as electorates do not demand that of them. And I can show you other societies, and they tend to be in the Nordic countries, where it is not like that, where the politicians are, in fact, under pressure to continue to follow social agendas that were laid down 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 years ago. In Sweden, they still talk about the work that was done back in the 1950s by the husband and wife team of the Myrdals, who in effect defined what the post-war Swedish state needed to be and what it needed to do with families with children. And they will define for you all of the steps that have been taken over time. And when new governments come along and try to, play short-term memory games with the electorate, they are punished at the polls, right? So we need that. We need the citizen to be a long-term thinker. And finally, we need the citizen to be an empathizer and a solidarity builder, right? It is very important for us to be able to build solidarity across the life course, as well as across the cultural boundaries that exist in our society. And that requires work. It requires empathy. It requires bringing empathy to the social level. Otherwise, what we're going to end up with, presumably, are wars that will set the old against the young. And that's certainly a danger in the public spending realm. Or to set various ethnic enclaves against one another. So the issue of being an empathizer and a solidarity builder fits in there as well. And so when you think about what I'm saying here, about that collective implementation goods require citizens who are literate, legitimizing long-term thinking, and empathizers and solidarity builders, what I'm saying is it requires citizens who they themselves have had a good start in terms of their language and cognitive and their social emotional development. In other words, we need high-quality early human development to generate collective implementation goods in order to get high-quality early human development. So in summary then, what am I saying? Well, I'm saying that despite past successes with certain kinds of challenges for which collective implementation goods are the answer, that the big challenges of the 21st century, which I'm going to say are one, shrinking our ecological footprint to a globally sustainable level and investing in the early stages of human development, do tend to raise pessimism and fatalism because of how complex they are. But that shining a light on this issue of the challenge of creating and maintaining collective implementation goods may allow us to see them through some sort of a lens that will allow us to address them in a constructive way. And so what I'm trying to say is that although we as a society tend to be better at addressing technological challenges than we are at social challenges, that we can see the notion of collective implementation goods and how we produce them as being a tool for social innovation, the way that Google could be seen as being a tool for, say, information management. And with that, I'd like to leave you with two questions to think about. The first is, can we create collective implementation goods in the context of a society like ours where among families with children, income inequality is rising and more the education market is being segmented, that more and more people are disaffiliating from public systems and looking for private systems to put their children into and are looking for a private way to get advantages for their children? That's one question. The second question is, as a more fanciful thought experiment, what would happen if society's basic monitoring tool were, instead of being our gross domestic product per capita, which is a measure of the size of our economy, instead was a measure like healthy, happy, fulfilled life years per molecule of carbon dioxide produced, right? And with that, I'll stop talking. Thank you very much for listening.
Dr. Hertzman, thank you very much. Fascinating stuff. Stay right there. I'd like to call on a fellow of the Royal Society, a history professor here at the University of Saskatchewan, Jim Miller, to make a presentation.
Dr. Hertzman, in a province like Saskatchewan, with a very large cohort of youth, a talk such as you just given could not be any more appropriate or needed. And we hope that your engaging and compelling presentation on this critically important issue will help build momentum for public awareness and government policies to address the challenges the province, like most parts of the country, faces in the area of early childhood development. On behalf of the University of Saskatchewan, its fellows of the Royal Society, and most especially on behalf of the audience here today, I'd like to thank you for the presentation. Please accept this small token of gratitude from all of us here at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr.
Thank you very much.
careful as you take a look at that.
Yes, yes.
All right, well, we've still got some time here to open up the floor for some questions and answers. For those of you who do have to run right now, I should mention that this lecture is going to be posted on the U of S research webpage, so you can recommend that to your friends. And when you do leave, there is an evaluation form, I believe, at the back that if you could please fill out. So we still have some time, so let's open up the floor, see if you have any questions. Do not ask him the one thing we can do, right? That's the one question he doesn't want. So, so just raise your hand or stand up so we can hear you would be terrific. Yes, right down there.
Yes, very good question. So the question of what are the factors that allow some children to be vulnerable but invincible, as they say. That actually, turns out, has a relatively simple answer to it, which is that it tends to be the children who, even though their immediate family has not been very supportive, that one way or another they find or are found by one or more adult who is a champion for them, who is crazy for them, right? And that's a very, very important thing, because the early research on that really came down to, the kids who had the winning personalities or something like that that would attract people to them. But we now know that it doesn't just take that in fact, in environments where you have children who come from socially isolated families, etc., you can, in fact, for instance, by doing community school programs and things like that, you can bring adults into the school and you can match them up and you can do big brothers and big sisters and you can do those kind of things and you can create champions for children. And that is really the key thing there. So that one, luckily enough, has a relatively simple answer to it.
Next question.
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
So your indicator is more related to neighborhood level assessment. So the role of the family, because it's evolving and changing over the time, there's a different factors. So how you see the effect of family over the development of the child?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I mean, obviously the family comes first in terms of what matters. I mean, the family is where you're either going to have attachment and bonding or not. It is where you spend most of your waking hours, and so your language interchange, the examples that are set about how social negotiation all take place in the family. The family sets the socioeconomic status for the child and the resources that are brought to bear and all of that. So the family is very important. And the trick is, you see, that in Canadian society, there's been way too much rhetoric about the idea that we either support families to take care of kids or the state steps in and provides care, right? And the "or" has been the destructive word. It's a question of both, right? So if, in fact, we come up with a policy mix which involves strengthening parental leave programs so that more families can take them and fathers can take some of the days, et cetera, without penalty, that we manipulate labor standards so that if you want to drop from working full-time to 26 hours a week, you don't lose your pension entitlement, that sort of thing, then we can do direct support to family to help deal with work-life, home-life conflicts. At the same time, if we strengthen a lot of these programs that are designed to help with vision, hearing, dental, speech and language, and other developmental things, we have an opportunity to be able to help track children longitudinally over time, so you can pick up the kids that are developing well and start to fall off the developmental curves. So it's much more sensitive than just going in once and then waiting to see what they're like when they reach school age, right? And so you can do that, and you can use those as a platform to bring all sorts of resources to bear with to families with children. But at the same time, right, the quality of care that we provide in center-based care both with parents present and with parents not present, is absolutely crucial. And Canada has the lowest rates of access to quality childcare in the Western world. And it's been a huge problem, right? And it's still a problem of every individual family trying to sort things out for themselves. And so there is no contradiction between the things that involve directly making the parent's job as primary caregiver easier and also providing care environments where kids can be when parents are not around, right? So those things are all of a piece. The other piece, though, that I was mentioning is that it is an empirical fact that in Canadian society, by the time kids are 3 or 4 years of age, the quality of the neighborhood that they're growing up in is, in fact, influencing their development, regardless of what the family's like. So whether or not the neighborhood is safe or not is mattering. Whether it's perceived as safe or not is mattering, right? Maybe even more than whether or not it is. And it's amazing how unsafe Canadians think that their neighborhoods are, right? And that has a direct impact on whether or not kids get out to play and stuff like that, right? The socioeconomic mix matters. So it turns out that if you are a family, from economically challenging circumstances, your children will do better in the early years in a mixed neighborhood than they will in a low-income ghetto, which has unambiguous meanings for housing policy, right? Thirdly, it turns out that neighborhoods that are cohesive around children, as simple as, do the adults in the neighborhood, if they see a little kid wandering around, will they feel that they should go and find out why that kid's wandering around by themselves and want to find the parent or something like that, right? A simple measure like that. In communities where most adults say that they would do that sort of things, kids are doing better on average than they are in neighborhoods where parents don't say that, even after you take into account everything else. So cohesion matters, even on that level. Mm-hmm.
And the political opposition has in effect resulted in blocking what could have been a historical development for this country.
Yes, I take that as a statement, and I recognize it as a challenge. I'm of the view, and I suppose you are too, that we're in a rather odd time in Canadian political history. That the spirit that existed, let's say, back about 40 years ago, when everything from the unemployment insurance system to the pension plan to all the stuff on the status of women and the expansion of the education system were done, has kind of it's petered out of our society quite a bit, right? And so these kind of solidaristic things of saying, you know what, we as a society need to pull together to be able to help those who are falling behind stop falling behind, that there isn't that much of a zeitgeist like that anymore, right? And we need to get it back, right? And, given that I suppose we're on the first day of a federal election cycle, it will be most interesting to see which politicians speak to the idea of creating a more equitable society versus which politicians speak to a society of, keep it to yourself, resent your taxes, and, pull up the drawbridges, right? That will be a very interesting part of our next 2 months of our lives, I think.
There are a couple questions more over here. Raise your hand. Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I remain troubled about the implication that we are going to somehow support parents to do a better job with their younger children. When what I see is multi-generational pain,
Mm-hmm.
where the parents themselves struggle, they grew up in their own childhood struggling, their parents possibly too,
Mm-hmm.
for a variety of reasons which I won't try to articulate in
Yes.
this short talk.
Yeah.
But there's a huge amount of pain there, and the fear I have is that we exacerbate that problem, and the parents
I totally agree with you. I mean, this is actually one of the points of communication that is so hard, right? Because on one tack you can say, I've been there, you can say, you know what, it's about the kids. We have to provide stuff for the kids so that they can thrive, right? And you go for a while like that, and then people say, you see, you're ignoring the families. You want to take the kids away from the families. You want the state to get in there and destroy the family unit in Canada. So then what you do is you tack back and you say, no, what we recognize that families are very, very important. So we want to support families to be able to work with their children and to do things with their children, but at the same time, it also means providing a lot of things at the community level, that the parents can't do it on their own, right? Which, of course, in one's head means in some cases parents can't do it on their own because they're too busy. In other cases, the parents can't do it on their own because what needs to happen is an intergenerational cycle of deprivation needs to be broken, right? But the problem is that once you start talking about families in that way, then people pick up the idea of, okay, they're backing away from public provision now, right? And so we end up in this endless difficult situation in Canada. And let's face it, I mean, you do have the problem when you start talking about villages raising children, right? I mean, the village that tried to raise the Aboriginal children in the past did so by creating residential school, right? So the history of community action in this country is dreadful, right? And now we're stuck with the intergenerational implications of that. And it's actually interesting, I have to say, tying back to something I touched on very briefly, with the work we're doing through the Human Early Learning Partnership. We have an Aboriginal steering committee that works with us, and we are now at the point of talking to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the way in which residential school experience may in fact be biologically embedded through these epigenetic mechanisms we're talking about before. And, let's find a way to start thinking about that, what it means, because, the work we have from long-term studies in some countries, intergenerational studies and animal studies, suggests that, in fact, once these stresses imprint themselves on the genome of one generation, it's going to take several generations for that to wear off, absence of some intervention, right? So, and there's something interesting, because once you start to biologize the thing you're talking about, you also get the split response. Some people will say, well, great, if you start to biologize it that way, you're taking the stigma off me, as a residential school survivor. Other people think that it's Orwellian and it's Strange-Lovian, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't get away from the controversy entirely that way.
All right, I think we've got time for one more question. Was there someone here? Over there. All right, right in the back there at the red shirt. Go ahead.
Yes. What we're talking about is that right now Canada spends 0.3% of its GDP on early learning and care. The countries that are doing better than Canada spend about 1 to 1.5% of their GDP. So we're talking about 1% of GDP. So if you put that in comparison to what we spend on healthcare or education, it's relatively small, but it's still a relatively large amount of money. And of course, in financially straitened times, there's a question of where it comes from. Well, put it this way. Back when we signed the Canadian Children's Agenda back in 1999-2000, if at that point there had been a policy around the country to ring-fence the spending that we had on early learning and care plus education from 0 to 18, and said, we're going to hold it constant as though this fraction of the population is not declining as a fraction of the population, and assign the surplus from the school age to the early age, we would now be at the point where we would be spending 1 to 1.5% of our GDP in the early years. But of course, what's happened in Canada, going back to the 1970s and again with JCAP in 1989 and again when the Conservatives cancelled the federal-provincial transfer for childcare, we've had a whole series of opportunities to start gradually increasing our spending incrementally in intelligent ways in that direction. And because we haven't taken them that, we're now stuck with this hole, right? We have, about a $15 billion hole per year in what we're not spending, right? But it is possible even now to be able to do demographic harvests of that sort and to be able to go in that direction.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up right there. That just flew by. Unbelievable.
Yes.
Thank you so much for a fascinating discussion this afternoon. Thank all of you for being here today and contributing